Get out the insurance cards, get out the co-pays. The office is open, my friends. Brought to you by drroto.com.
What is up, and welcome in. We are the One and Done Show. We are your fast break of college basketball information. I am your host, Eric Romoff. You can catch me on those Twitter streets at FantasyNav. You can do your part in this enterprise by scrolling over to those like and subscribe buttons, giving each of them a click. And he is the captain of our ship. He is navigating through these hot dog days of summer in Texas. He is MC Holland34 on Twitter. Mike Holland. Mike, how is it going tonight?
It's going good, man. Yeah, I'm back in the heat, 105 degrees after coming off a vacation in Destin, Florida. So, got to hit the beach for a few days, which was really nice. Got some much needed time with the wife and friends. But while I was out on the beach, still working on previews and outlooks for every conference. So that's been a little bit of a chore, trying to pop these out here in the next month or so. Our guy Jay Heinrich with Green Screens Media and drroto.com has also been putting out our top 20 returning players. So you can find that on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok handles. Football's around the corner, but hey, that just means basketball's not too far behind. So it's going to be a pretty busy fall. I'm looking forward to it. And, tonight we get to dive right back into the SEC and we get to talk some Auburn Tigers basketball. So to help us do that, we bring in Auburn beat writer for 24/7 Sports and host of Auburn Undercover podcast, Nathan King. Nathan, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are y'all?
We are doing well. We're excited to be back in the one and done saddle, and we can't think of a better program to kick us off with. So definitely appreciate you making some time for us and helping us get up to speed on all things Auburn hoops. And I want to start with kind of a recap from last year, right? It was very much so an ideal regular season. The Tigers won the SEC during league play. They locked up that 2 seed coming out of the Midwest Division in the big dance. But then those high expectations were fell a little bit flat, right? They were ultimately bounced in the second round to the 10 seed Miami. So I want to know from you, how would you grade the overall performance last year, and what's sort of the mood around the program heading into the 22-23 season?
Oh yeah, I mean, I feel like A plus, I guess you would say, is winning the national title, right? I mean, A or A minus, something like that. I mean, you look at what Bruce Pearl has done with this program, and it's just sort of stair-stepping. You just continue to raise that floor and raise the expectations. You talk about an ideal regular season. Yeah, absolutely. 15-3 in league play. Longest winning streak in program history at 19 games. First time ever that they've come in at number 1 in the polls. They were pretty unstoppable there in the meat of SEC play. And looking back in hindsight, now that we know what Walker Kessler and Jabari Smith became by the end of the season, it's not very surprising to see how that happened when became number 3 draft pick, probably the best 18-year-old shooter on planet Earth, and then the National Defensive Player of the Year. So, and then like you referenced, toward the end of the year, they did sort of falter off. I would say over the last 2 weeks of the season, they also got bounced in the very first game of the SEC tournament in Tampa. Similar struggles, and you guys know when things start to become a trend at the end of the season, that's bad news. It very rarely can you just buck that all of a sudden. And so really what it was that high pick and rolls with Walker Kessler and 7'1" dude. I mean, it was just unstoppable. And then if you left Jabari Smith one-on-one, that was also unstoppable. Teams started to figure out the half court sets over the course of the season. And Bruce even talked about it. He said, I didn't adjust well enough. This was not one of my best offensive coaching jobs over the course of the season in terms of Ken Palm and all kinds of efficiencies, top 15 defense, top 10 at their best points. But like you said, I mean, they got blasted in that Miami game. It was shocking to us there in Greenville. It was their largest margin of loss, I guess you would say, of the season by a pretty big. It wasn't even close, their number 2 game. And so, but when you look back at the season, I think Bruce put it really intelligently at the end of the year. He says, it's easy to say we peaked too early. And he was like, we probably did. But what happens if you don't peak then? You might not win the SEC championship. You might not go 15-3 in the league. And then maybe you get to the tournament. Yeah, if you're a little hotter, maybe you win one more game. But then all of a sudden you have no championship to show for it. And you get bounced in the Sweet 16. And so, I mean, you guys know it's all about when you get hot. That's what that Auburn team a few years ago did on the Final Four run. They went 11-7 in the league, which is pretty good looking back. But they just got hot at the right time. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely a fantastic season. Then Jabari and Smith and Walker Kessler become the first duo in Auburn history to go in the first round in the same year. And so program expectations where they are at the moment, recruiting, it's what Auburn's hanging its hat on. This is a football school, of course, but currently at this moment in 2022, everyone points to the basketball program. Bruce Pearl definitely has it, churning in the right direction in pretty much every single facet.
Yeah, it's been fun to see what he's been able to accomplish so far. Before we dive into this new look roster here, I just want to get some more thoughts on Bruce Pearl. You kind of mentioned it here, just all the success, the rising ladder here before he came on. I mean, there was only 3 tournament appearances in 26 years before that. So what does Coach mean to this program? And do you see him here until he hangs it up?
Yeah, so last year he got given, quote, lifetime contract. That was just what the athletic director called it when it came out. And we didn't know that. We assumed people actually do sign lifetime contracts. Turns out it was an 8-year extension on top of what he already had. But if I were a betting man, Bruce Pearl is retiring here just because of the kind of infrastructure that he's got set up. Again, as I referenced previously, what that university support looks like, you're talking about in your athletic program, pointing to that, it looks like brand new practice facility. It looks like whatever he wants. I mean, he's the guy running the shots and calling the shots in the athletic program right now. And so, anything he needs to keep this program on top. They just renamed the arena with a massive donor, donation. They're getting a brand new practice facility that's linking onto it. And they did all that with pretty subpar facilities. And to be honest, Auburn Arena, it's Neville Arena now. It's the smallest venue in the SEC. It's not particularly special in one way or another in terms of the way it's built. The only reason it's the way it is because of Bruce Pearl. And so I sound like I'm going over the top here, but it's difficult, like you mentioned, because of where the program was before he took over. Difficult to overstate what he's done, because over history, Auburn's been a bottom 3 or 4 team in the SEC. That's just how it is over the course of their history. Like I said, he's got everything in his arsenal right now to be able to succeed moving forward. They hope, obviously, the NCAA stuff is behind them. I'm 99% certain that is the case, because they took that self-imposed postseason ban during the COVID season. Not that they were going to make the tournament that year anyway. Kind of worked out nicely for them. But yeah, it seems like, again, upward trajectory. If you're looking at the grand scheme of not only SEC programs, but power programs around the sport, if you're going to hitch your wagon on somebody right now in 2022, Auburn is as good a bet as anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like you're gushing a little bit over Bruce Pearl, but to be fair, I mean, how could you not, right? His results speak for themselves, and moreover, he really has built a culture of excitement around this program. So the 8-year or lifetime contract, depending on who you ask, certainly well-deserved. Want to move on to a couple of guys that you talked about or touched on earlier. Jabari Smith, Walker Kessler, off to the league. Both were first-round picks, and that leaves a bit of a void in this front court, right? So you've got Johni Broom coming in through the transfer portal. You've got your 5-star high school recruit, Johan Trejord. Both seem like likely candidates to kind of fill that role in the front court. So I want to know from you, what can you tell us about their games and their expectations for both of them coming in? And is there anyone else in the front court that you see kind of stepping up in the absence left behind by Smith and Kessler?
Yeah, it's good timing. They just played a game today. It's the first time they've ever had one of their foreign tours televised. It was on SEC Network. They played the Israeli under-20 national team. I believe it was 117 to 56. Once they started to get rolling, it's a different league, essentially. Those two guys in the front court, there's no shortage of talent right now. But when you compare it to what they lost, there's obviously going to be a drop off. Like we talked about, that pairing of Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler. It's tough to find a pair of All-American teammates, let alone All-American teammates who are playing your 4 and your 5. And so just the way they complemented each other. Jabari Smith's offensive game by the end of the season, I remember when he went 8 of 12 from 3 against Vanderbilt, and we were all just like, yeah, this dude could be the number 1 overall pick. And you just kind of see him evolve over the course of the season. And then, when Walker Kessler was getting triple doubles with blocks, and he did it not once but twice, also the same thing where it's like, yeah, this guy's probably the National Defensive Player of the Year. So you're talking about, an instant replacement for both of them. You mentioned Johan Trejord, 5-star power forward, about 6'10", 230. really raw athletic game from him. And you could see that, although he led Auburn in scoring today. He had 20 points in 8 boards. Kind of a guy that maybe you can see feeling things out at the start of the season. I'm actually not sure whether he will be the starter. Obviously, we're super far out at this juncture, but he'll be playing the 4. And I think they'll probably go with a guy, Jalen Williams, who he's been a good role player for them over the past couple of years. Actually, his sophomore year, he was their starter at the 5. That was when they were the youngest team in the country, and they just kind of had to play small ball. He's their starter at the center spot. Really efficient player for them last season. And he was a guy Bruce Pearl said, look, he could have transferred when you're bringing in Jabari Smith, taking over that spot at the 4, and you're a veteran, and a freshman's going to come in and do that. He could have transferred, but they're going to reward him for sticking around, and now he's heading into his senior season this year. Would not be surprised if he's the starter at the 4, but when Johan comes off the bench, it might not really matter. He's obviously got a higher talent ceiling. And then Johni Broom, I think he has a chance to be the best player on this team. Today he went for, let me pull up the stats. Yeah, he's 17 points today, 8 of 9 shooting. That's pretty good. 9 rebounds and 4 blocks. Again, level of competition extremely low in that game. But he kind of flashed everything they knew he would have. At Morehead State last season, you're talking about a post game and you're talking about rebounding. That was really the number 1 and number 2 things he did. And then he was the OVC Defensive Player of the Year. He was top 5 in the country in blocks as well. And so never easy to replace a couple of first-round picks, especially guys that made the sort of differences that they did on offense if you're Jabari Smith, on defense if you're Walker Kessler. But they have a couple worthy candidates. I think Auburn fans know, though, to kind of temper expectations and see how this front court rotation plays out. But I wouldn't be shocked if by the end of the season we're talking about this as being, top 4 or 5 front courts in the league.
Yeah, I could definitely see that with Broom, Trejord, Williams. Definitely has the makings of being a solid front court. Want to slide over to the backcourt and talk about, the returning guys here. Katie Johnson, Wendell Green, one of my personal favorites. Alan Flanagan, who looked pretty good today. Zep Jasper's coming back. They're all contributors last year. Looks like this backcourt's obviously going to play a pretty big role early on. Is there a player in this group that you would consider an X factor? What are your thoughts on the backcourt?
Yeah, really interesting group because they get their trio of, I'd say, veterans. I mean, it's two juniors and a senior. All 3 of them transfers. So Zep Jasper was their starter at the 1 last season. But over the course of the year, Wendell Green, whom you mentioned, again, doesn't really matter who's starting if the other guy ends up playing more minutes. They just liked the kind of, shot out of a cannon off the bench is kind of what Wendell Green would give you. And so they like that. A little bit of an undersized point guard. Of course, Bruce Pearl, that's kind of his forte. These days, he actually just landed another 5'11" point guard a couple of days ago in the 2023 class. So, they're all very different, all 3 of them. Zep Jasper is extremely mature. His turnover rate, John Rothstein would tweet about it like every other day. He turned the ball over like 7.4% of the time per 100 possessions, or something crazy like that. Katie Johnson is a psychopath, and I can only say that because Bruce has 100% referred to him as that. That's one of the most entertaining players in the country. You just keep an ISO cam on him, but he's an undersized 2 guard, very talented scorer. He saved them in a couple games, the Georgia and the Missouri games last season. He actually saved them toward the end of the game because he's just a guy who could create his own shot when they were doubling Jabari Smith. And then Wendell Green, maybe I'm interested to see what he does in late game situations this year, because I think it was at least well documented in Auburn. I don't know if nationally it was picked up that it was the Florida game and the Arkansas game. You had Wendell Green taking the last shot, sort of maybe an ill-advised 32-footer, as opposed to possibly the number 1 overall pick and one of the best offensive players in the country, feeding him. But that's easier said than done. But Wendell Green, like I talked about earlier, that high pick and roll with Walker Kessler, excellent passer. You're talking about the alley-oops, all that kind of thing. He has great vision on the court, a lot like Sharif Cooper, who they had a couple years ago, just a good floor general. And so with all 3 of them, I wouldn't describe any of them as being elite. Maybe 1 or 2 of them will get a preseason 2nd or 3rd team all SEC nod, but I do think for them to take the next step, because that's ultimately it's not their downfall. Their downfall was actually the front court in that Miami game that they lost. But the overall inconsistencies, which is always the case, came from the backcourt. You had Wendell Green, shooting 2 of 17 some nights. Zep Jasper just completely would lose his touch sometimes. So overall, of course, on the season, they were great. But down the stretch, I think Bruce Pearl will be the first person to say that maybe a little bit more consistency out of that group as a whole this season. But still, the underlying factor is that you're talking about 3 returning guards, all really experienced, all have a year in the SEC under their belt, and they give these new front court guys that are coming in, they give them a lot of confidence.
Yeah, and I'm gonna file away that psychopath nickname, because coming from Bruce Pearl, a guy who has no shortage of energy, that is incredibly high praise. For those of you that are checking in with us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. And then we want to hear from you in the comments. Who do you like to be the X factor for the Tigers next season? Definitely want to hear your thoughts from the fan perspective. There's certainly no shortage of viable options for players to fit that mold. Nathan, I want to jump back to today's international game. You mentioned that Auburn really ran away with this one pretty quickly. It was a 119-56 final. But even with that first action of the preseason, technically, so I want to know if there's anything that we can kind of take away or learn from this game, being that it's the first time we've seen this team take the court.
Yeah, it was great for them. Everyone got to play. Everybody who is on this roster and in the main rotation checked in and played today. And obviously, even a couple guys who are not going to be in that main spot. Talking to Bruce Pearl about it last week, he said, we'll probably rest 2 or 3 guys per game just so that we're not, we don't want to max things out right now. We all assumed that meant, okay, you'll rest like rotation guys, that way, the other guys can play actual, game minutes. He apparently meant let's rest the bottom of the bench because everybody played. I think the biggest standout, a couple guys that we've yet to mention. This is a deep team. Not every part of the team is super proven, but there's still going to be your second or third guy in your rotation along the wing, or the 2 guard that was like a 4-star recruit, or a guy that's a junior and has been here a long time. So the potential is there. A guy named Chance Westry, who is pretty interesting. He's a top 50 recruit in the class. He can play the 1, 2, and the 3. First time he checked into this game, he was running point, looked smooth doing that. He's funny because he's the number 6 player they've ever signed or something like that. But he's just getting overlooked because of a guy like Trejord or a guy like Johni Broom, who was a big transfer pickup, maybe one of the best bigs on the transfer market. And the fact that, you had Jabari Smith last year, the recruiting keeps on moving up. So when a guy is, he's only the number 48 prospect in the class, he's, it's almost like he's overlooked. But you saw that talent on display today. There wasn't a soul in that arena. I'm not sure anybody on Auburn's roster could have stayed in front of him. Fantastic first step. Super lanky. We're talking about a guy who can run the 1, and he's 6'6", 6'7". Excellent extension to the rim. And then a guy that I neglected to mention when we talked about the front court is Dylan Cardwell. Dylan Cardwell is a junior. He's been playing the backup center spot ever since he got on campus. Obviously, was backup to Walker Kessler last season. Great energy player. He's kind of like your prototypical college basketball player. Just runs around, bunch of energy, grabs a bunch of rebounds, blocks a bunch of shots. He was a really interesting addition to the draft process this year. You're not going to find him on any sort of draft board. He's a backup center who averaged like 4 points a game. But it's such a low stakes, high reward situation for guys to enter the draft process. Talking about what he learned, worked on his post game. It really was all offense for him because he's been such a defensive, kind of rebounder throughout his career. Saw a little bit of that today. I've been seeing it in practice all summer, and giving him a little shimmy in the post. I think his rolls to the rim were a little bit smoother than they've been before, and of course that's a product of working with NBA personnel for a little bit. And so those were Broom. We talked about Broom and Trejord, the 2 new front court newcomers. They were excellent. I think everybody knew they were going to be pretty good. And so these were the guys who kind of stuck out today. Again, there are 2 more games. So next they'll play the Israeli All-Star Select team, which as I understand it, there are 2 different leagues there. This is the All-Stars from one of the leagues. So I guess it's like half of the best players that they've got. And then the last game is expected to be their most difficult. They're just straight up playing the Israeli national team. And so today it was the under 20. This one, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but they've got a player who plays for the Wizards who's going to be on this team. And so they'll be going up against an NBA talent, I think, at the 2 guard spot. So really excited to see what else we can learn from them. But there were a couple standout players today. Overall, though, again, overmatched team, and everybody kind of got theirs. But I would say Chance Westry and Dylan Cardwell were the ones who at least surprised me the most with how effective they were.
Yeah, I was able to pick up a little more than half of the game watching some afternoon hoops here. And yeah, Westry really stood out. Katie Johnson, his outside shot looked pretty good, obviously, against lesser competition. But I think that's kind of a big question, right? You kind of talked about it. They were 25th in offensive efficiency last year, final on KenPom, despite shooting at the 269th in the country from three. So is this team going to have enough outside shooting? And is Bruce Pearl going to have to maybe change some things up with the new look of this roster? Or do you foresee more of the same pace and up and down, and it's just whether the shots go down or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because last season you had a couple guys who, primary offensive skill set was that three ball, who were expected to be on the roster last year, who weren't. Justin Powell, who transferred to Tennessee, kind of a mysterious situation with him after one season sort of went dark and then went elsewhere in the SEC. I believe he's at Wazoo now, could be wrong. And then Trey Alexander, who some people might know that name because he was really big for Creighton in, I believe they played Kansas in the NCAA tournament, and he was pretty big for them in that game. Both sharp shooting two guards who, 700 days ago, Bruce Pearl expected to be on his roster for last season. So, and just in terms of pure 3-point shooting, it was Jabari Smith, who, by the way, best 3-point shooter in the SEC is 42.5%, I think, on the season. Again, 6'10", it's super stupid. But everybody else, I mean, it's severe drop off from there. Multiple guys in the 25, 26 range. You're talking about guards. I think Wendell Green shot something like 28% on the season, and that's your primary point guard. And so, it's funny because you look back and it's other factors with this team under Bruce Pearl that determine how far they go or whether they compete for an SEC title. Because I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I looked and, because I was questioning after the season, all right, how does this compare? How bad is this 3-point shooting? There have been 3 Bruce Pearl teams before this one that shot worse from deep. Obviously, the one, the Final Four, I think they finished the year like 31st in 3-point shooting. Everyone remembers, of course, that team could just shoot the light. That's how they got to that point. Other than that, that's not the identity of a Bruce Pearl team. And it's funny because he's got such a green light. And so you would expect that, them to be a 3-point shooting team. That's always what Bruce says. He says, we're a 3-point shooting team. I never said we're a 3-point shooting making team. You talked about whether their identity was going to be different this season. His offensive playbook has just been so successful. Stephen Pearl, his son, is a great play caller on that staff. It's just been so successful. He's had such a good plan for so long. I don't foresee it being changed. They were after a couple guys in the portal that were pure 3-point shooters, but they just couldn't land them. Chance Westry, whom we just talked about, he was a good 3-point shooter. In high school, Trey Donaldson, we haven't mentioned him. He's a freshman point guard. I don't know how much he'll get in the rotation this season. Also a good shooter in high school, but Trejord didn't really shoot the three. Johni Broom, I think he has 2 career 3-point attempts, and so at Morehead State in 2 seasons. And so I don't know if that's something I'm necessarily banking on improving this season. But at the same time, like you were mentioning, there were a lot of games where they had great looks. And like I said, they run that offense pretty effectively at this point, going into year 9 for Bruce. They know what they're doing, but it's just the past couple seasons, they really just haven't gotten them to fall. So maybe third time's the charm, because I think the season, 2019, they were a pretty good 3-point shooting team. Maybe this is the year where they'll finally be able to knock down some of those open looks, because, I mean, in terms of proven 3-point shooting, I haven't looked at the comparisons, but this is probably, second, third, or, maybe the worst team in the SEC in terms of what they've got coming back this season.
Yeah, and when you're losing the most prolific by percentage 3-point shooter in the conference, obviously it is a tall order to improve in that area, but certainly an area to watch as we get a little bit closer to the season. I want to stick with the SEC and kind of get your gauge for how Auburn fits into this picture, right? It has been an absolute arms race in the conference. Obviously, you're going to have to contend with teams like Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee for that regular season crown. Do you think that this Auburn Tigers team has enough to compete in this, fully loaded SEC?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think right now, unless it's a depleted season, 2020, the roster just did not go as planned. They went 13-14 on the year. I think they went 7-11 in the league. Other than that, the past 6 seasons for them, they haven't contended for an SEC title every year, but they've had the opportunity to do so. Obviously, they won 3 SEC championships between the regular season and tournament over the past 5 seasons. They've got 3 titles in that span, and so Whether they have enough on the roster, I'd say absolutely. When you look at the the combination of a couple guys who in an Auburn uniform are unproven in the front court, but you're talking about a 5-star and one of the best bigs in the transfer market. So you got to think they're going to figure that out with what we mentioned before, a veteran backcourt. Presumably, I think if all three of those guys that we mentioned, Jasper, KD Johnson, and Wendell Green, I think if all three of those guys take that like presumed, it doesn't even have to be a huge step, but if all three of them take a tiny step forward, I think that'll just do wonders for this team. One of those categories, of course, has to be 3-point shooting, but I mean, roster talent, they're probably not on the same level, definitely not on the same level as Arkansas. I mean, that team's just loaded. Kentucky, of course, is going to have a nice bounce back season this year. And then you mentioned Tennessee. I think Tennessee is kind of built the same as Auburn over the past few years. They've got their cornerstones every season, and then they're coached really well in the regular season. And so, but the expectation now, year by year, again, unless you've got a depleted roster for one reason or another, is that top 4 finish. I think that's kind of where the program's at. That's where Bruce Pearl's at. I mean, last year they were picked 5th in the league, and they ended up winning it. Now, again, a couple newcomers that people didn't know how they didn't know they'd have 2 All-Americans, of course, but that's around the range this team is going to be expected to have for the foreseeable future. I would think, I haven't necessarily thought about it too much, but picking them 4th or 5th in the league, maybe 3rd as a ceiling is probably what you're looking at this year. And if they don't get that double bye in the SEC tournament, if they don't get because that sets you up for a 3-4, probably the lowest being a 5 seed in the NCAA tournament. I mean, if you don't get that, that's a disappointing regular season for Auburn, and that's just kind of where they've set themselves up as. And so, yeah, compete, definitely. They absolutely believe they can compete for an SEC title this season. I don't know if they can have the same success in the regular season, but again, last year it was a bunch of regular season success and then very little postseason success. So I'm interested to see how much this team grows over the course of the season.
Yeah, so it's going to be a fun SEC to watch. It really is every year. But I just want to get back to the roster and some future news that you kind of teased a little earlier. The news dropped yesterday. Obviously, the program received a commitment from 2023 point guard Aiden Holloway from California. He's ranked the 30th best player on 24/7 Sports Composite. What can you tell us about this commitment and the player?
Yeah, Holloway could be a 5-star by the time it's all said and done. Of course, like that mid-20s to low 30s range, it kind of has to break your way in terms of evaluations. But he's a guy like a Chance Westry, where the word I always use is fringe 5-star. A guy that he's right on the cusp of being one of the most talented players in the country, and it continues to be, like we were talking about with the mold they have for an offense or whatever, just the continuity they've had as a staff and with what they like to do. This is a Bruce Pearl guard. We've come to see it. Jared Harper sort of set the tone for that. He was a low-rated player, but just came in and just absolutely excelled in Bruce's system. Then you go to a guy like a Sharif Cooper. Now you got a guy like a Wendell Green. That it's becoming a very, very attractive place for a dude who is. I know it says he's 6 foot. I've seen him in person once. I think he's probably more like 5'10", 5'11". Just an electric offensive playmaker like that who can get up and down the floor. Pretty good defender, great shooter. Go look at his Peach Jam highlights from a week ago. He was one of the best players on the floor in games where he was going up against Bronny James. And so in terms of your first pickup, because 2023 is really important for them, they could lose if things break, I say the right way, because it'll probably break this way if these players have a good season. But in terms of roster, might be kind of dicey. They could lose a lot of guys off this team or even the next season. And so 2023 is kind of your foundation for what does this roster look like when it flips completely over, when the guys who are here right now completely are gone. What does that team, maybe, say for a freshman or two, what does that team look like? And so a high 4-star who completely fits your system, that's probably a pretty good cornerstone. And it's worth mentioning that Holloway and a guy named Wesley Yates, who is a high 4-star shooting guard, they're best buds. They've talked about playing together in college. I'm not sure how realistic that is at this point, but I know that Aiden Holloway is already on top of him to try to come to Auburn. It seems like it might come down to an Auburn, Arkansas, maybe Miami battle for Wesley Yates. And so it'll be interesting. Musselman and Pearl, of course, have had some pretty good matchups on the court already. We'll see if it turns out that way on the recruiting trail. But yeah, Holloway, we knew it was coming for about a month or so. Makes a ton of sense. I think he'll be, obviously next season, probably an instant impact player for sure.
And a lot of really good stuff to know about Holloway, and all the better if you can get the double dip and bring in his buddy Yates alongside with him. I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the NIL landscape and how it has changed the picture for college athletics. I want to know from you specifically, what is this athletic department doing to maximize the NIL opportunity for their players, and what does the overall market look like for Auburn players?
Yeah, so I don't think it would be outlandish or unfair to say that Auburn was sort of fumbling through the NIL situation maybe for the past 6 months. They got off to a strong start. I mean, maybe everybody got off to a strong start when it happened. You had a million players with the deals and whatnot, and there were a bunch of collectives popping up on campus. That's great. It sort of became a situation where you look at you look at an Ohio State or an Alabama or a Georgia or a Clemson. It seemed like they sort of had their ducks in a row, a little more organized, and saying, this is our collective. This is what we're focusing on. This is how we're distributing compensation to the players. Auburn didn't have that. They had something called NIL Auburn that was run by a bunch of the big wigs in town, a bunch of former players. Not great organization there. And so actually a couple months ago, NIL Auburn dissolved and they completely reorganized. And now it's a new collective called On to Victory. And they launched just last week, at the end of last week. This is going to be Auburn's flagship. I don't know what it's called at Ohio State. I don't know what it's called at Alabama. But that primary collective, their goal across all sports is $30 million every year. I spoke to someone who expects millions, in parentheses S, whatever, donations from around 15 to 20 people a year. And you look at the personnel, I guess you would say, involved in this. The leader of it is a guy who made the biggest donation in Auburn athletics history 3 years ago, something like $35 million. So that's decent financial backing to have. And so when you sort of zoom back in and talk about how that relates to Auburn basketball, Bruce is normally on top of this kind of stuff. Not much in the modern game he's not going to get left behind. I think this doesn't necessarily take him by surprise. He's somebody that I have heard about conversations he's had with people around the program saying, because this new practice facility, it's not here yet. He is kind of making it known, I'll live without the practice facility for another couple years. NIL needs to be our absolute focus. And so that's the standpoint where it's coming from Auburn. You feel its effects all over campus. It helps to have someone like Suni Lee, who is an Olympian. I saw her Gatorade commercial like 2 hours ago. So obviously that kind of thing, helps when you're at Auburn. But yeah, in terms of the basketball program specifically, definitely feels like they could be at the forefront. Again, football, we won't get into football. It's not a football podcast, but Brian Harsin, obviously that whole thing is pretty muddy. Seems like it might be getting a little straightened out at this point. But again, Bruce Pearl calls the shots. What he says goes in the athletic department. And right now what he says is NIL is the most important thing. Facilities used to be the most important thing, where you would direct all your money to. Now NIL is the most important thing in recruiting. And that's obviously what Auburn needs to keep its success going.
Yeah, following NIL is it's pretty dizzying, and hopefully we can get some sanctions or at least some regulations to figure out what's going on everywhere here. But been fun to follow. So we're under 100 days finally till tip here. So just a couple of critical factors that you think Auburn fans should consider here when they're looking for a successful season this year.
Yeah, so I'm pulling up the schedule right now. A really good non-conference slate, I think, would be key for them, because it was pretty tough for them last season, and they blew right through it. And so, I would say probably the toughest game they've got in non-conference. They go to USC. Obviously, that's been a fantastically coached team over the last few years. They're actually doing a Pac-12 road trip. They'll hit Washington, so they'll go to Seattle like a couple days after that. Split those games, and I think you're in pretty good shape. So, getting off to a good start, which is not a given for this team. I think, we shouldn't have been surprised with how fast they gelled last season. Again, in hindsight, that was what everyone was saying. That's probably why they were picked fifth in the league last year. Was, well, Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, and mind you, Wendell Green, KD Johnson, Sepp Jasper, all newcomers, all transfers. It might take a little bit of time for them to get together. Thinking back to practice and what I was watching, like in mid-July, it did not take them much time. And so this team, I think, will be really good. Not exactly getting the same instantaneous vibes right now. That's because you don't have two bona fide NBA players on the roster. And so Maybe their ceiling in the postseason could be higher. Maybe you've got, because what's so interesting to me about this team is that they don't have a true alpha for the first time in 5 seasons. You had Chumo Kiki as a sophomore, definitely emerged into that. He was on a team with Jared Harper, who was as alpha as they come at point guard. Then you had Sharif Cooper. Then you had Isaac Okoro. And last year was Jabari Smith. This year, who's your number one in terms of your offense? KD Johnson probably thinks he's number one in everything, and so he's gonna definitely make his case for that. I think Johni Broom could be the best player on the roster, but he's a back to the basket post player. Is that guy capable of being your number one scorer? And so maybe that turns out to be I think maybe that could be a good thing in the long run. Obviously, everybody's sort of jockeying for position there, but like you referenced before, SEC right now getting to 10 wins in the league. That's fantastic. I mean, that guarantees you. I mean, you're in the tournament. Congratulations. I mean, even if your non-conference was, so-so, if you win 10 or 11 games in the SEC as it currently stands, I mean, we saw LSU losing games last year and they'd rise in KenPom. So, like, this is just the point of where we're at right now. I think their SEC schedule actually works out really well. Your road games are the ones where it's kind of iffy. And then the home games are the ones where you're like, yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to play like Missouri on the road. You'd want to get them at home and just lock them down and beat them. And so, absolutely Auburn should be top 5 or 6 in the league with probably, 2 or 3 being a ceiling for this team. And again, this is one of the most interesting teams Bruce Pearl has ever had, just because, like you mentioned, it doesn't seem like the 3-point shooting is going to be fixed. It almost seems like it's the exact same identity as last season, just with a couple new characters put in there. And so, yeah, I'm really interested to see what kind of season turns out for them. I think, maybe defense is probably, you talked about factors for a successful season. That's kind of something that has kind of hovered in the background. Everybody thinks about Bruce Pearl teams as being run and gun and high flying. Obviously the Final Four run did a lot for that. I mean, they've been a top 20 defense for the last 3 or 4. Even when they were bad in 2020, they were number 1 in blocks. And I think they were 17th in adjusted defense. And so that is something big too. You can't fall into the 30s or 40s, because then if your offense slips, all of a sudden you're losing close games. And so, that's probably big for them. It looks like they're going to be a good shot blocking team again. But yeah, I think I've probably exhausted my storylines there. It's just, again, it's going to be a really interesting season just because of all these factors that you have at play that honestly, after covering Bruce for 5 or 6 years, it doesn't seem like he's ever necessarily had these before.
Nathan King, AuburnUndercover.com. If you are an Auburn Tigers fan, if you are an SEC basketball fan, if you are a college basketball fan, and you are not following Nathan, what are you doing? His handle is ticking along the bottom there. Nathan King 24/7. You can find all of his work at AuburnUndercover.com. Nathan, thank you very much for spending some time with us, for educating us on this Auburn program. If you are still watching with us out there and you have not already, get on down to that like and subscribe button. Give those a click. If you have been following our content either here on the YouTube channel or all of Mike's work over at drroto.com and you are not already subscribed, get over there, get subscribed, get into that members-only Discord, and let's get this bread.
Thanks for stopping by the office. Get your fantasy prescription by subscribing to the channel and checking out drroto.com. And until the next visit, be well and take care.